Our first presenter is Caitlin Drummond, who comes to us from Carnegie Mellon University. She's going to be talking about some of her work in the development of a scientific reasoning scale. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Caitlin.
All right, thank you guys for your patience. Let's try this again. My name is Caitlin, and today I'm going to be presenting some of my research on scientific reasoning. And so before I begin, I'd like to give a really quick note about my background, given that this is such an interdisciplinary conference. So I'm a PhD student in behavioral decision research, and what this means is that I study decision making. So as someone who studies decision making, I tend to look at decisions from several different disciplinary perspectives. So one perspective we can use to examine decision making is the normative perspective, which looks at what people should do. So for any given decision situation, given someone's beliefs, their values, what information they know, what is the decision that they should make? The descriptive perspective looks at what we actually do, which not unsurprisingly is often different than what we should do in many situations. And so if we, as decision scientists, wish to kind of help to bridge the gap between what we actually do and what we should do, we might use the prescriptive perspective, looking at different interventions we can implement, things like giving people more information or helping them better understand the information that they have in order to bridge this gap. So I'll be giving a little bit of each of these three perspectives in the research that I'll be presenting today. Now, my research specifically focuses on understanding how non-scientists who lack scientific training think about and use scientific evidence. So today I'm going to first start out with a discussion of what is scientific reasoning before talking about the scientific reasoning scale, which I've developed with my co-author and graduate advisor, Dr. Woloshin Schwartz. And I'll be presenting some of the results that I've received from my research so far with the scientific reasoning scale before concluding with some implications of my research for science communication. So what is scientific reasoning? Many different disciplines have been debating this question for quite a while. In particular, cognitive and developmental psychologists have suggested that there are two components to scientific thinking, two ways that we can think about science. So we can think about first the products of science. These are the things that science has enabled us to know about the world, whether it be our conceptualizations of certain scientific phenomena or the facts of the sort that we might learn in school. And in tandem with the products are the processes of science. These are kind of how science allows us to know what we know. So the processes of science might include things like designing experiments to test your hypothesis or evaluating your evidence to tell whether or not it's in support of your theory. And so when cognitive and developmental psychologists talk about scientific reasoning, it refers to the usage of these processes that are key to the scientific enterprise. To illustrate the difference between products and processes, I'd like to call our attention back to early 2016 when the flat earth theory made a bit of an unexpected comeback on Twitter. So the rapper B.O.B. posted this tweet saying, you know, let's look at the evidence of our senses, guys. If we look around us, it really seems like the earth is flat. And so everyone's favorite defender of science, Neil deGrasse Tyson, of course, had to jump in on Twitter and told B.O.B., hey, you know, okay, you might be a few centuries behind in your thinking about science, but that doesn't mean we still can't enjoy your music. And so I bring up this example because I think it's a really interesting example of how we can attempt to use the processes of science to call into question or challenge the products of sciences. So here's another tweet. This is B.O.B. in the foreground, and he's in a fairly high elevation looking back on two cities. And he says the two cities in the background are approximately 16 miles apart, but when he looks out over this high cliff, he says, even they seem to be, you know, I don't see any curvature. The earth seems flat to me. So he's attempting to think scientifically to kind of come up with a counterexample that is disproving the well-accepted fact. Luckily for us and for physicists everywhere, his test of whether or not the earth is flat is a little bit flawed. So his scientific reasoning is not quite spot on. For many reasons. For one, he's not considering the alternative hypothesis that the curvature of the earth is just so gradual that it's really kind of impossible to tell whether or not it is curved using just the naked eye. So he has some very imprecise measurement instruments here. But so this raises a related question, which is that as a scientist, we might be interested in knowing whether our audience, whether non-scientists like BOB and others, are capable of using these processes of scientific reasoning, whether they're able to think like scientists. And sometimes, as we can see from this example, this might lead them to question some things that we scientifically might think to be well-accepted facts. So this leads into the development of the scientific reasoning scale, which I developed with my graduate advisor to attempt to start to measure this at an individual level, the ability to think like a scientist. So the development of the scale is fairly complex, and I've left out a lot of detail, but if you are curious, there's some more details in the papers, and if you do have any questions, please ask me about it, because I'd love to talk more. But I'm just going to go over the development on a bit of a broader scale. So when developing a scale, the first step is to define what the heck it is you're trying to measure. So our first step was to find scientific reasoning. And throughout the rest of the talk, you can think of scientific reasoning as the ability to assess the quality of scientific evidence, which necessitates the usage of the processes of science. Next, I identified concepts for inclusion on the scale. To give you an example of some of these concepts, there are things like being able to think causally, to separate correlation and causation, the understanding of the importance of control groups, and so on. After identifying these concepts, we wrote test items, one of which I'll show you in just a minute. And then finally, because this is a psychometric scale, we can assess its performance in terms of different specific properties. And so I won't go too far into this, but the two main properties that we looked at were reliability, which is the scale internally consistent? Are all of the scale items measuring the same thing here, which is scientific reasoning ability? And validity, which is how do we know that the scientific reasoning scale is actually measuring scientific reasoning ability? So to give you an idea of what the scale is, the final scale is 11 items long. On average, people answer between 6 and 7 items correctly across samples. Here's a sample item to give you a sense of what the test items really look like. So each item starts out with a short scientific scenario. Here's the scenario. Subjects in an experiment must press a button whenever a blue dot flashes on their computer screen. At first, the task is easy for subjects. But as they continue to perform the task, they make more and more errors. And this is followed by a true or false question. So here the question is true or false. The blue dot must flash more quickly as the task progresses. So this true or false question requires participants to really think about and reason about the information that they've been given in the scenario. So in this case, the participants are thinking about why is it that participants in this experiment that they're reading about are making more and more errors as the experiment continues. So one potential reason is that the blue dot is flashing more quickly. The task is becoming more difficult. People are making more errors. But there are other reasons to explain this decrease in performance. Factors such as boredom, perhaps the task is getting very boring, or fatigue. So if we're asked whether or not the blue dot must flash more quickly, because we can think of alternative explanations, the answer to this question is false. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the sorts of reasoning that participants need to do when answering these questions. Let me tell you a little bit more about what we found with the test itself. So we find that people who score more highly on the scientific reasoning scale also score more highly on these related measures. So they score more highly on the cognitive reflection tests. They tend to be more numerate. They report having higher levels of education. And they also have higher scores on 2 existing civic scientific literacy scales. I also find that scientific reasoning scale scores are largely unrelated to demographics. So we do observe a consistent age effect. A lot of this probably has to do with education, so this correlation is greatly decreased when we control for education. But we find that scientific reasoning ability doesn't differ based upon political or religious beliefs, nor does it differ based upon gender. Here's a more interesting test of the scientific reasoning scale. So my co-author and I were curious as to whether scientific reasoning scale scores were related to participants' beliefs about science, especially for controversial issues. The idea being that someone who scores more highly on this scale has greater scientific reasoning ability, so they're better able to assess the quality of scientific evidence. So we would expect that someone who's better able to assess the quality of evidence is more likely to hold beliefs that are actually in line with that evidence. So what we did here is we assessed participants' belief on these 5 controversial issues: the existence of global warming, the safety of genetically modified foods and vaccines, and the existence of human evolution and the Big Bang. And so what we find is that for most of these beliefs, participants with higher scores on the scientific reasoning scale are more likely to report holding beliefs that are in line with the scientific consensus. And these relationships continue after we control for things like political beliefs, religious beliefs, and education. Another test of the scientific reasoning scale was assessing whether scientific reasoning scale scores predict the ability to use scientific information. And for this, we used a validated drug facts box task from Schwartz and Woloshin. And the task goes a little bit like this. Participants are first given information about a fake prescription drug, here, Paxid. They're told some quick information about what the drug is for, who might consider taking it, and so on. Next, they're given this study findings box. And in this box, they are shown the results of a drug trial comparing Paxid to a placebo. And they're shown numerical information about the effects of Paxid as well as its side effects. And so using this study findings box, participants then answer questions about these results, such as, true or false, Paxid and placebo work equally well at completely relieving heartburn. And so what we expected to find, and what we did find, was that people who scored more highly on the scientific reasoning scale did have higher scores on the drug facts box test, including when we control for things like education. So quickly, I'm going to go over a few future directions for my research. What I'm working on currently for my dissertation research is developing a model that predicts when we engage our scientific reasoning skills and when we might not. So I'm looking at this engagement as a function of both individual factors, so your scientific reasoning ability might be one of those, but also situational factors, such as what you're motivated to do in a certain situation, and things like trust. So to bring back to our B.O.B. and Neil deGrasse Tyson example from earlier in the talk, as B.O.B. may or may not have learned, the question of whether the Earth is round is not necessarily something that we can observe for ourselves very easily. And there are many situations in science where we either lack the tools or the technology to really test the scientific evidence ourselves. And in those situations, the issue of trust comes up, and that do we trust these scientific figures to, be telling us the truth about the world around us? Another future direction is to design interventions to encourage the use of scientific reasoning. So one thing I've been working on is priming scientific reasoning by having people take the scientific reasoning scale before engaging with scientific evidence in order to kind of increase the accessibility of these scientific reasoning skills and increase the likelihood that people will apply those skills to the problem. And finally, I'm developing a short form of the scientific reasoning scale using item response theory. The idea being that for many nationally representative surveys, time is very constrained. The scientific reasoning scale is 11 items long, so it does take a good deal of time to administer. So for these reasons, a short form is definitely useful, and it helps also to overcome one limitation of my existing research, which is that I've mainly been using mechanical Turk workers so far. And then finally, I'm just going to close with a few implications for science communication. The first implication from my research is that for many people, scientific reasoning is really challenging. So what this means is that for us as scientists, we do have an ethical obligation to avoid overstating our findings to audiences who might struggle to differentiate between low and high quality scientific evidence. Additionally, we should avoid relying on our intuition when we're seeking to convey the importance and the quality of our research. As we observe through our studies, it's pretty unlikely that non-scientists are judging scientific evidence based upon the same criteria that the scientific community has agreed upon. So our intuitive reactions when our research is called into question might not be seen as particularly convincing or understandable even to our non-scientist audiences. Additionally, our research does suggest that scientific reasoning might help individuals be more critical consumers of scientific evidence. So I've just presented some evidence showing that scientific reasoning ability might contribute to the usage of science communications, as well as help individuals assess controversial science. So I haven't run the study, but I would expect that people who are higher in scientific reasoning ability are probably less likely to believe BOB when he says that this is very convincing evidence for the world being flat. And finally, some more recent research of mine suggests that scientific reasoning might not prevent scientific skepticism. So motivation is a pretty powerful factor in impacting how and when we use our scientific reasoning skills. And in particular, the results of one more recent experiment, we found that encouraging critical thinking amongst our participants did make people more skeptical of scientific evidence in general, but it didn't make people any less biased in terms of being biased in favor of evidence that supports their views as opposed to evidence that is counter to their views. So that's where I will conclude. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. I'll ask you the first question. I enjoyed reading your paper. You described how you started enumerating 20 different concepts you thought were relevant, and now you've described an 11-item scale that you're trying to reduce even further. Could you say something about that process?
Sure. So initially I identified a set of 20 concepts for potential inclusion on this scale. And what I did is a few various psychometric tests. So what I really did to develop this final scale is use the technique of factor analysis to assess kind of the underlying dimensionality, what underlying latent abilities are driving people's responses on each of the questions. And so what this showed was that for these 11 items, it seemed like they were quote unquote loading on the same factor, meaning that they were all being driven by the same underlying skill, which was suggested, seems like, this scientific reasoning ability. So that technique was used to kind of trim down the list of potential items to the final items that appeared on the scale. And trimming it down further, we'll definitely use additional techniques like item response theory to get a group of items that helps us to differentiate between people with different levels of scientific reasoning ability in the shortest amount of time possible.
Great. Skip?
Yeah, I have a question and also sort of concern.
Sure.
So the first thing that tipped me off here is I think you can't call it the scientific reasoning scale.
Why is that?
So there are so many areas across science, education, and so forth where people try to measure things like knowledge or reasoning or thinking and so forth.
Right.
And when a knowledge space is multidimensional, and when there are different sort of cognitive sequences that can lead you to an outcome, there's no single, unless things really work out in an interesting way, it's unlikely that there's a unidimensional scale that is the only representation of that process, right?
Okay.
So I'll go a little deeper now. When you talk about scientific reasoning, and if you were to construct a scale and say it's general, what you're saying is that the small set of items you have are representative of a larger space and cover it comprehensively.
Right.
Right. But that's documenting either of those things is interesting, because then what you have to do is define the entire space. And that's trickier than it sounds, because suppose now we define a space of like what could be reasoning or things of that nature. We not only have to define the space, we have to make a decision about whether certain points or regions in that space are equally or more important than others. So for example, in something like scientific reasoning, like yours is an additive scale, right? And so many of these knowledge or reasoning scales that people put forward are additive. But when you step back and think about why would an additive scale be the optimal representation if, let's say, certain types of facts or reasoning skills are, say, 4 times more important than others, then an additive scale would actually misrepresent the space. Or if there were parts of the space that were only relevant to reasoning only if other previous things had been done. So let's say there are 2 regions in the space, and region B matters to reasoning only if you understand region A.
Sure.
Then again, an additive scale would not be the optimal way to do that,
Sure.
because you'd never want to count number 2 unless number 1 had been satisfied. So I think V is a problem, but these scale. But more generally, as you defend this, I think these are useful things to to think about, because there are people in the room who've done this. There's a black hole of controversy not too far from what you're talking about. The last thing I'd say is factor analysis here is problematic. So what factor analysis can do is show you that things are related to one another. What factor analysis can't do, it's completely unable to tell you what you discovered. So you can show that a set of factors are clustering around something, and then you can use other tests to try and figure out what it is, but you can't use factor analysis to tell you that the thing is scientific reasoning.
Right.
It just doesn't do that. So I think, this is a neat project, but there's, I think other people will probably come in. There are lots of places where people have done this, and you just got to realize there's competition. So at the end of the day, I think the best way to define a scale like this is to say there's a certain set of tasks that we're interested to see if people can do. We have a well-defined theory of how people do those tasks, and this set of questions represents that theory in the following way, and then people can evaluate it, and you can see if it does the task. But I think if you, coming back to one of your earlier slides, if you call it a scientific reasoning scale without any of those caveats, then you're subject to overclaiming and some controversy that you may not want.
Sure, no, thank you. You make a lot of great points, and I think I took out a lot of the scale development nitty-gritty from this presentation, but I think it would have really kind of affected the way you see the scale. So I realize that there is certainly competition in this space. I have defined scientific reasoning ability in terms of the ability to assess the quality of scientific evidence, and I did do a very kind of careful and systematic searching through that domain of what scientific reasoning is to come up with the list of initial 20 concepts, which I didn't describe very fully in this presentation, but to answer some of your questions. So what I looked at in terms of what sources are there for the concepts that are key to assessing the quality of scientific evidence, I looked at two sources, one being research methods textbooks, which attempt to communicate the kind of agreed upon standards of the scientific community for conducting high quality research, as well as several methodologies for assessing the quality of research, so things such as the risk of bias tools published by the Cochrane Collaboration and so on. So using those sources, what I did, I went through very systematically, drawing kind of key concepts and seeking umbrella concepts when possible, combining concepts into kind of broader categories. So those 20 initial concepts weren't just kind of selected from the literature at random. I really went through a thorough and systematic process to attempt to define the domain of scientific reasoning and then sample systematically within that domain. Now, I agree that the choice of factor analysis in order to narrow down those concepts into the concepts included on the final scale can certainly be problematic in that we can never know what those factors are that we identify in our data. I made the assumption that because I'd gone to such a length to define what scientific reasoning is and to really thoroughly assess many sources for the content of scientific reasoning, go through those systematically, that whatever factors I observed in my data were, because I had gone through those definition and sampling steps, were reflective of scientific reasoning, although certainly that is absolutely a limitation of factor analysis. And so, there are additional concerns. So these tasks, like you mentioned, there's one task per concept, and obviously for scenario-based measures like this, there is additional variance due to the scenarios. But these measurement and kind of definitional issues surrounding any scale are absolutely, it's great to hear and to talk about this with you. I mean, I think they're very important issues for social science in general. So I hope I answered your question.
Dan?
So I thought that was really interesting too. I wanted to just see if you might say more about what you said you were anticipating doing, which was looking at how the disposition that you're measuring with your instrument might relate to how people engage with controversial science issues.
Sure.
And I'm motivated too by what Skip was adverting to, the experience, the existence of alternative measures and their experience with trying to explain people's variance in positions on contested issues. So things like Miller's civic science literacy measure, but also numeracy, cognitive reflection. It seems like all manner of measures of critical reasoning have this quality that as you do better on them, rather than seeing polarization on issues like climate change abate, you see it get bigger. And you say that you adverted, I think, maybe to some work that might be consistent with that you're doing. But I'm wondering, even if in the data that you have, you might see some evidence for this, or at least I thought I saw some evidence in what you reported as pretty close to, a zero correlation, but trivial, to the point of being essentially zero correlation between your measure and positions on climate change. But also you were reporting the partial correlations with the other, so it was less than 0.2, right, on something like evolution, which means that like only 4% of the variance on the, and you said you're controlling for things like religion, but I know religiosity explains a lot more than 4%. It's probably going to be 60, 70%, which would suggest that in fact it's not explaining much. There's not much connection between your measure and positions in evolution. And then you said you controlled for things like political ideology, but the right way to specify the model would be to see if there's an interaction. And I wonder if you've done this, because in all the studies that have shown that you see magnification of the polarization conditional on the reasoning proficiency, the way you test that is to look at any given level of the proficiency, is there more or less division among the groups that otherwise have positions that are opposed on the issue. If they're diverging, well then obviously the reasoning disposition in question isn't one that has the quality of causing convergence. But you wouldn't see that by controlling. What you would do is try to see whether conditional on the same level, any given level of the reasoning disposition, what's the amount of variance that there is in that's being explained essentially by the individual difference. So have you actually, rather than controlled, used an interaction between political ideology and your measure in looking at any of these controversial issues?
Sure, no, that's a great question. So to answer your interaction question right off the bat, no, I haven't really done many analyses like that. What I've been thinking about how scientific reasoning interacts with people's kind of opinions and beliefs on these controversial issues is that scientific reasoning skills are something that you can use kind of for good or for evil to defend your existing beliefs. The idea being that things like political and religious beliefs are often very important kind of starting points for how we think about an issue. And insofar as we can use our scientific reasoning ability to defend our beliefs, we can continue to believe the way that we do on controversial issues as long as we can use our ability to criticize whatever science opposes us. So in the more recent study that I pointed out, what I found is that people are capable of thinking critically about scientific evidence, but still being biased in the way that they are seeking to defend their beliefs in tradition, and then consistent with the motivated reasoning tradition. So I would say that in terms of a theory of scientific reasoning, because I have defined scientific reasoning as this ability to assess the quality of science, I can look at when people are using these abilities to kind of either attack the quality of science that they disagree with or promote the quality of science that they do agree with, and examine kind of in these situations how and when are people using their abilities to either support their beliefs or potentially change their beliefs. Although if reading the literature on motivated reasoning and confirmation bias and so on leads you to be a little bit discouraged about when people actually do kind of change their mind on such important issues that might draw on aspects of identity and self-esteem as well. So I think this is an interesting point.
Quick follow-up, because you said it might, in the end, I think in your last slide you said that the proficiency that you're measuring might help people when they're looking at contentious issues. Does help actually mean be able to use it to reinforce the position that is consistent with their identity then? Because that's what you just seem to be saying.
So I think that you can, so you can use your scientific reasoning ability to reinforce the position that's consistent with your identity. But if the weight of the scientific evidence on something like evolution or the Big Bang is so compelling to suggest that their existence, then I would think eventually you would reach a tipping point where your scientific reasoning abilities, you just simply cannot continue to criticize the evidence, that is just so overwhelming, your ability to assess the evidence, you can't kind of reconcile your beliefs with the evidence at hand, if that answers your question.
Caitlin, I think this is really important, and
Thank
I
you.
think that this is really needed contribution to the literature, and it'll have a multidisciplinary impact. I'm on the board of overseers of the ANES right now, and as soon as you get that shortened scale, I'd like to know, and I will be a strong advocate for it on the national election study, because I think this is so important, and I think it is a very distinct, conceptually distinct from these other measures that folks are mentioning here. And so I actually don't have many or maybe any of the concerns that Skip, just to tell you that not all political scientists think the same. I don't have many or even maybe any of the same concerns that Skip has about that you follow up on, because I think you've done a lot of that already, and I think that if you can demonstrate that it is different than the existing scales, as Dan was mentioning, in its predictive ability, especially around this point, because I think this point about how what we find and what Dan shows repeatedly and others is that the more sophisticated you are, the better able you are to defend the the perspective that your identity dictates when that identity, especially when that identity is salient. But I've long suspected that the sophistication itself is like the first definition of scientific reasoning that everyone mostly uses, which is the number of facts that you've learned. And the number of facts that you've learned isn't the reasoning ability, right? So so the reasoning ability, it may be problematic in the sense that you use your reasoning ability to come to the wrong conclusion. But sophistication, if it's just the number of facts, you could have actually arrived at those facts without reasoning. You could just have been told, this is what our group believes.
Absolutely.
And so it's still potentially, since we don't have a really great measure until your work, it's still possible that this is ameliorative of that problem. And I think doing the work that Dan just mentioned, showing that interaction, I mean, that's what a lot of political scientists and political psychologists are really interested in you doing. So you can publish in our journals when you run that correlation. Perhaps you need to wait till you get a better data set, but that's not a question. It's just a really excited, encouraging remark, I think.
So far I've tabulated 2 statements and 1 question, but I'm sensitive to the clock. We have 2 other people that I've seen raise their hands. I'm going to...
I want to ask Nick a question.
I'm going. I think this is Caitlin's. I think this is Caitlin's forum, John, and then David.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions about this.
Sure.
As you know, some of those items that you have come from the science indicator set that I built some years ago.
Sure, I've used those.
And I've read your article with Brooke very carefully in terms of the 2015 article.
Yes.
I have a couple of observations and questions to you. One is you went immediately to true false. It looks like I don't see any description in the thing about going away from open-ended. And over the years, one of the reasons we've used open-ended is that we don't have room for 20 items, but a good open-ended question is as good as 6 open-ended or 6 closed-ended. So that's one question. Why did you consider that and reject it for some reason? And the second is, you're using a simple true-false, which I think in my reading of it is the last 10, 15 years, both in the United States and Europe, we've moved into a mode of definitely true, probably false, and definitely false, because that reduces the guessing parameter. If you're going to do IRT, the guessing parameter, when you use the 4-fold, will go down by a factor of 75% or so. So I was curious as to why you chose sort of the older method of doing this.
Sure.
Did you consider that? And I will try to reach out to you with some things. I noticed that you said in your white paper that you had done some confirmatory factor analysis.
Yes.
I disagree with Skip. I mean, confirmatory factor analysis is a good Popperian way of falsification. It doesn't tell you the name of the factor, but it tells you they don't fit. So I wouldn't discard confirmatory factor analysis. But you mentioned that you've done one, but it doesn't appear in your 2015 paper either.
Oh, it's in there.
Pardon?
It's in there. It's in study 2. It's hit right after the exploratory factor analysis. I have a separate sample in which I conduct a confirmatory factor analysis.
Do you have a table of loadings?
I do have a table of the, I believe it's table 6. I don't have a table of the factor loadings for the confirmatory factor analysis, no, but I do have a table with regards to the results of the confirmatory factor analysis.
Yeah, I think that if you're when you're thinking about shortening, or anyone else is thinking about shortening, that kind of factor loading table would be very, very helpful.
Great, yeah, thank you. With respect to your true or false design choices, yes, having a creating the scale such that each question had an objectively correct answer, and that I could assess people's answers by means of a closed format question was a design choice that Brooke and I made very early on. So each of the items on the scientific reasoning scale, there is a correct answer, true or false. And so on early versions, we were interested in not just people's answers, but also their confidence in those answers. But I think that answers, that's a related but sufficiently different question that a kind of a purely test of ability. We wanted to have a kind of a very simple answer choice to kind of make it a bit more cognitively easy for the participants to simply choose true or false. Obviously, we didn't choose things like multiple choice because we weren't interested in participants kind of seeing whether or not we, the experimenters, were trying to trick them by putting, a red herring answer or anything like that. So we settled upon the true or false response option because it seemed to preserve this quality of having an objectively correct answer while making a kind of minimal demands upon the participant in terms of the amount of different answers that they needed to consider. An open-ended response question, so another thing that I did not include in this presentation, but it is included in the 2015 paper, is that I did, throughout the process of developing the scale, collect a lot of qualitative feedback. I asked people first to answer the question, then to tell me why they answered the way that they did. And that qualitative feedback was used to iteratively edit and update questions to better understand how participants were thinking through these scenarios. And so the final scale for kind of ease of usage across many different researchers and lab groups was, I decided to make it something that was easily scorable, but I agree that the open-ended responses can give you really a wealth of data that I mainly used in kind of the front end of developing the scale, but I'm certainly interested in using those sorts of open-ended response formats, although they do have additional issues of things like inter-rater reliability and consistency of coding across different raters and different years and so on.
There's
Can I make one quick follow-up question on that?
Sure.
If you, on some of the questions, for example, where you said you and Veruca decided that these were really right and wrong, I would just caution you that you may have gotten some of these already, you had open-ended questions, but for example, on the experiment question that you have about should you have the two groups or the one group and so forth, when we first asked that, the questions looked strange to me, so I put a probe in and said, why did you choose that? And so you've got a certain number of people who say they choose the two group, which you deduce as maybe something like a control group. But then when you ask them why did they choose the two groups, about 30% of them say it's because if the drug kills people, it kills fewer people. Now, that's really not a correct answer.
Sure.
So, and unfortunately, the Science Indicators has dropped the probe because they want to do it more efficiently. But you get a huge error in that because people who say you need to have two groups, at least 30% of them are still dead wrong in terms of scientific reasoning.
Right.
So just in terms of the accuracy of it, I would just caution, apart from the efficiency, we also want it to be accurate.
Absolutely, yeah. So to the best that we could, when we developed these questions using the qualitative, the probes, that to the best that we could, we were able to kind of see how those responses fall out and alter the question contents accordingly. But that's a really, really great point.
I wanted to mention that in advanced online issue, I don't remember whether it's POQ or survey research methods, Roger Tarango and his colleagues have a report on the results of testing open-ended and closed-ended questions about scientific knowledge, and find that the closed-ended items, I believe, are fine, but you should take a look at this. One more question.
Okay, so, it's not so much a question as a comment.
Another statement.
To take on the controversy of whether this is predictive of opinions or views on controversial issues. So I think there's a real confounding, an important confounding factor, because reasoning is about starting with a set of uncontroversial and accepted, universally accepted premises and see whether you can reason through them to the right conclusions. And one difference between people who believe or reject climate change and other things is that they don't agree on the facts. And I think that you can reason very, very well, but if you start from a set, or at least a partial set of beliefs, which is wrong or flawed, then you can reason well and get to the wrong conclusion. So I really think a validation of the reasoning component of the scale would really have to work with a scenario of a more complicated problem. You know, you're an archaeologist and you have a set of findings incomplete. You need to decide are these, 2 cultures, 3 cultures, and go through a step or sequence of tests that will test clearly only the reasoning. It will not be contaminated by prior beliefs and prior facts.
Right. That very much jives with the way Baruch and I have been thinking about it, which is that we can understand exactly people's are people logically reasoning? Are they reasoning scientifically, but from flawed premises, or are they? Yeah. So I absolutely agree with you that this reasoning and the premises we can separate out, and to the extent that I've attempted to do that in the research so far to really examine people's reasoning.
Please join me in thanking Caitlin for her presentation.